Welcome students to Lesson 3 of the Living World topic. In this lesson we are going to be exploring an important idea. When an ecosystem changes suddenly, why is that a problem for the living organisms within it? Please write the date, title and learning objective and have a pen and paper ready to learn. Okay, time to review prior learning. Please write 1 to 10, answer the questions from memory and then mark your answers. Game time. Number 1. Interdependence means the relationship between organisms in a food web. If the population of one organism changes, this affects the population of others. 2. A detritivore is an organism that feeds on rotting material, which makes it easier for decomposers to break down, for example worms. 3. A primary consumer is always a herbivore, which means it consumes vegetation, plants. 4. An ecosystem is the community of biotic and abiotic features in an area. 5. A consumer that has no predators is called an apex predator. 6. Soil is composed of decomposed organic matter and minerals that come from weathered rock. 7. Biomass decreases higher up a food chain because not all the organisms are eaten or some energy is excreted in the form of food. 8. The Nigerian author who was executed for protesting corruption was called Ken Saro-Wiwa. 9. The main religion in North Nigeria is Islam. 10. The NGO that provides mosquito nets and helps people sell them in Nigeria is called Nets for Life. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 8 or above, you are the master. Write any questions you got wrong and their answers and test yourselves on them repeatedly. Well done. To introduce the idea of ecosystem change, I'm going to show you a photo, which you may all have seen, or similar photos to it. And I'm going to show you some questions around it. Answer those questions about that photo. Go for it. So number 1, what is this photo showing? Well, you should say that this photo is showing deforestation of the Amazon rainforest in South America. 2, what part of an ecosystem has been destroyed? Possible points you could have said: the biotic part, living, and also the producers. However, you may have also noted that since there's interdependence in an ecosystem, deforestation leads to the destruction of not only the trees, but also the living organisms that depend on trees. 3. How will this affect the population of consumers in an ecosystem and why? This links to the previous question. The population of consumers in an ecosystem will decrease significantly because there's less food to consume. And if there's less food for the primary consumers, then as you move up the food web, there's less food for each level above the primary consumer. This leads to a loss of population and a loss of biodiversity, the number of different species. 4. What impact will it have on global climate and why? Trees are carbon sinks, which means they absorb carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. They reduce the amount of CO2 in the global atmosphere. If you have fewer trees, then you have more CO2 remaining in the atmosphere, leading to global warming through the greenhouse effect. Okay. The key word of this lesson is a complicated one, so I'm going to introduce it to you by showing some ideas. If you've ever seen an archway in a house or a building, you may have seen the stones that look like this. There's one stone in particular that's very important, and it's this one here. It's called the keystone. If you take this stone out of the arch, the whole arch comes tumbling down. And so we say that there is something called the keystone species in an ecosystem. It is one that is particularly important. Let me show you. In this small food chain here, the keystone species is the shark. Why? Because the shark controls the population of stingrays. And if it controls the population of stingrays, then there are fewer stingrays to eat all the different smaller consumers in the ecosystem. So predict what would happen if you remove the keystone species, the shark. Well, you lead to this: a dramatic growth in the population of stingrays and therefore devastation of all the consumers beneath it. So the keystone species maintains biodiversity in the ecosystem. And if you remove the keystone species, then you decrease biodiversity, the number of different living organisms. So keyword today, keystone species. Write it and its definition, please. I'm going to give you another example of a keystone species, and I want you to predict what will happen. Okay, a sea otter is another example of a keystone species in an ecosystem, because the sea otter is the only organism to consume sea urchins which feed on kelp, a type of algae, a very large type of algae. The kelp provides a habitat for many thousands of species of fish and sharks and other creatures. It also provides food for them. Without the kelp, biodiversity increases significantly, and the kelp only survives because of the sea otters eating the sea urchins. So what will happen when you take the sea otter away? This. If you remove the keystone species, the sea urchin population explodes, leading to overgrazing of kelp, leading to loss of habitat for other organisms. So, this is an example of where sudden ecosystem change is such a problem. The keystone species matters, and if you take it away, then suddenly you lead to a loss of biodiversity. In this lesson, I'm going to explore 3 ways that ecosystems can change suddenly and show you why they have such negative effects. Overall, let's look at this food web, which I introduced to you last lesson. So why is ecosystem change, when it's very sudden, a problem? In a food web, the population of the different organisms is delicately balanced, which means they're stable populations. None of the species are increasing or decreasing in population too much. And that creates a healthy ecosystem with a high biodiversity. Here's how it works. All of the organisms in this ecosystem have adapted to survive each other so that none becomes too dominant or develops too much control over other species. For example, the python is a very big, powerful predator. It's got camouflage on it, which allows it to hide, and it's got special adaptations which allow it to be an excellent hunter. However, in this same food web, the frogs and the rats and the wolves have adapted to survive the python. Over many thousands of years, they have adapted. The rat is very good at hiding, it's very fast. The frog has camouflage as well, it's also very fast. It's also got poisonous skin. Because of these adaptations, the python isn't able to consume all of the rats and all of the frogs that it meets. And so the population of pythons remains balanced because it eats some rats and some frogs. But the population of rats and frogs remains balanced because many of them are able to survive the python. Similarly, the rats and frogs eat the grasshopper and the butterfly, but they don't eat so many of them that the population of these creatures disappears because these creatures have adapted to survive these creatures. And finally, the butterfly and the grasshopper, while they may eat lots of plants and producers, there are so many different types of producers because of adaptation of producers that not all of the producers are eaten by these primary consumers. As a result of the adaptations of every organism in this food web, none becomes extinct, disappears, and none becomes so dominant that its population explodes in number. So, if you take away one or more of these species, suddenly you lead to a loss of biodiversity because the balanced population of each organism in a food web is dependent on the other organisms. If you remove the eagle, then suddenly the population of pythons and wolves and thrushes and frogs explodes because they don't have as many predators, leading to a loss of primary consumers, leading to a loss of producers. That means that the number of different species in the ecosystem has decreased significantly. Loss of biodiversity. That is why sudden change is a problem. So one example of sudden change is if you take one important species out. Let me show you some others. One important example that is human-caused is deforestation. Why does deforestation lead to a loss of biodiversity in an ecosystem? 2 reasons. Number 1, in every food web, as you've seen here, the producers are the most important because they provide food for every organism above them. The loss of food through deforestation by destroying the producers means that biodiversity rapidly falls because the levels of the food chain don't have enough food anymore, and so the populations of each of those organisms decreases. That's the first problem with deforestation. Secondly, trees and producers in an ecosystem provide habitat. They provide safe spaces for certain organisms to live. Birds, for example, will only live in the tree. If you remove the habitat of the birds will go extinct or they will leave the ecosystem. So the loss of habitat also leads to a loss of biodiversity. Because of deforestation, human activity, for example in the Amazon rainforest, there's a loss of food and a loss of habitat leading to a rapid loss of biodiversity. Second example of sudden change. Here in Florida, in USA, is a food web. At the top of the food chain 50 years ago was the alligator, the American alligator, and it had no natural predators. And it was very good at hunting turtles and raccoons and lots of types of bird and fish. But it wasn't so good at hunting them that it could kill them all, because they had adapted to it over many thousands of years. All of the organisms in this ecosystem had adapted to each other. However, if you introduce a species suddenly, a predator, and it becomes very, very capable of consuming other organisms, it becomes an invasive species. For example, the Burmese python was introduced to the Florida ecosystem by owners of pythons who let their python pets go when they became too large. Here's the problem. The Burmese python has no predators in this ecosystem. Additionally, it is so good at hunting these other organisms because they have not adapted to it, so they can't survive its attacks, its camouflage, its speed. As a result, the Burmese python has led to a loss of biodiversity in this ecosystem by taking out too many of the consumers in the ecosystem. So invasive species damage biodiversity in an ecosystem because other organisms are not adapted to survive them. Another way an invasive species might be a problem is if you have a producer that is better than other producers at getting light, for example. It might be a tree that grows faster and therefore can spread its branches out faster than other producers, and therefore it's the only one that's able to grow. But in this example, the invasive species is the Burmese python because it has no predators, so its population grows very fast. It's also very good at hunting, much better than the alligator at hunting these organisms, and therefore it reduces the population of all the other consumers. Invasive species is another problem. And finally, eutrophication. Complex sounding word, but it's actually quite a simple idea. And here's how it works. Farmers in the primary sector often use a chemical called a fertilizer to help their crops grow. Because farmers are motivated by profit, they want money, they might often use too much fertilizer, or they might not be educated enough to know how much to use. Sometimes it rains right after they spread the fertilizer, it might be a powder or a liquid, on their crops. When it rains, the fertilizer is washed into a nearby sea or river or lake or pond. When this fertilizer reaches the pond, it causes algae to grow really rapidly at the surface of the pond. This algae, which is the smallest type of plant, blocks out the sun. And this prevents plants at the bottom of the pond or river or lake from growing because they can't photosynthesize, so the plants die. If there are no plants in the water, there is no longer oxygen in the water because the plants release oxygen into the water. If there's no oxygen in the water, then the fish and the other living organisms, the consumers, they die as well. The death of the plants and the consumers leads to a build-up of dead organic matter at the bottom of the water body. Bacteria and decomposers break down this dead organic matter. And when they do so, the bacteria absorb more oxygen because the bacteria population increases. This leads to a further loss of oxygen in the water. As a result of eutrophication, which means the rapid growth of one species, such as algae in a body of water, biodiversity in this lake or river decreases rapidly, and it looks like this. This is called an algal bloom, a sudden growth in algae due to the arrival of fertilizer chemicals in the water. And this kills off all the fish because there's no longer oxygen for them in the water to survive. Make sure you watch this video before we move on. Okay, time to test yourselves. Have a whiteboard ready or a pen and paper? Let's go. Question 1. Why are the populations in a biodiverse ecosystem usually balanced? The populations of different organisms. Why are they usually stable? The reason is because each organism in the ecosystem has evolved over many years to adapt to the other organisms so that they can survive them, and they are good enough at getting food and surviving being eaten that their population remains stable. And because each organism is adapted to each other, the populations don't change very, very much. Question 2. Why does deforestation decrease biodiversity in an ecosystem? You should have said that deforestation removes the producer. So there's a loss of food for primary consumers and a loss of habitat for all organisms in the food web, leading to a loss of biodiversity. Question 3. What's different between a keystone species and a normal species in an ecosystem? A keystone species is often thought to be the most important because removing the keystone species leads to a significant loss of biodiversity in an ecosystem, whereas removing another species might not lead to the same loss of biodiversity. For example, removing the sea otter or the shark from the two ecosystems that I told you about led to a loss of biodiversity because they were really important at controlling the population of other organisms. Final question. By eutrophication, and why do humans cause it? Eutrophication is the rapid increase in the amount of nutrients in a body of water, which leads to the growth of algae. And it's caused by the spread of fertilizer on crops, leading to the sudden increase in nutrients in water, which causes algal blooms. Okay, time to embed learning. Answer these questions using your understanding from the lesson, and then mark your answers. Go for it. Number 1, keystone species. 2, explain how overuse of fertilizers can cause fish to die in rivers. So this is about eutrophication. Should have said. Fertilizers enter rivers by surface runoff, so they wash over the land when it rains. Algae bloom. Fish die, loss of oxygen. 3. Using the example of invasive species, explain why sudden change to an ecosystem is often harmful to its biodiversity. Many years to develop into balanced food webs. Changes in populations affect other organisms. And then explain one of these ways that an invasive species can cause a loss of biodiversity. Give yourselves a mark out of the total and make sure that you've added any corrections or missing points. From this lesson, write 2 questions from memory, don't look back. Answer them from memory, and then test yourselves on those questions repeatedly. Thank you so much for joining me in this lesson. Next lesson, we are going to be looking at solutions to sudden ecosystem change. How can we restore an ecosystem so that its biodiversity increases again? I'm going to show you some very exciting projects that have been done around the world that have made this happen. Join me then.